Have you ever noticed how gray a president's hair is by the time he or she leaves the White House? Seriously, look at before and after photos of former presidents. Bill Clinton before and after. George W. Bush before and after. I guess you can't count the guys who wore wigs. So why the gray hair? Stress. Being the President of the United States is a stressful job. As the leader of the executive branch, the President is tasked with the power to make the tough, difficult decisions that will inevitably mold the future of the country, positively or negatively. And, just a hint, no one wants negatively. President John F. Kennedy found out just how stressful being president and utilizing executive power can be during a tumultuous event known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane photographed nuclear missile sites being built by the Soviet Union in Cuba. President Kennedy learned of the missile sites on October 16, which began the 13 days of crisis. Now remember, the United States was right smack in the middle of the Cold War, a period of intense suspicion and competition with the Soviets. The tension between the two countries included the arms race, which was a massive stockpiling of weapons, including nuclear missiles. Then came the Cuban Revolution, in which Fidel Castro took control of Cuba after a violent uprising. And of course, there was the whole Bay of Pigs fiasco, where the U.S. government funded a group of Cuban exiles to go back to Cuba and overthrow Castro. That didn't really go so well since it caused Castro to turn to the Soviets for help. Okay, fast forward to those Soviet missile sites in Cuba. You can imagine why the United States might find their existence problematic. Did I mention that Cuba is only 90 miles from the southern tip of Florida? On day 6, October 21st, after many tense meetings about the missile sites, Kennedy ordered a naval blockade, which is essentially a ring of ships to surround Cuba. The aim of this, quote, quarantine, as he called it, was to prevent the Soviets from bringing in more military supplies. On October 22nd, day 7, Kennedy addressed the nation, announcing the existence of the missiles to the American people. In addition to the quarantine, Kennedy demanded that the Soviets remove the missiles already in place and destroy the missile sites. As an aside, this picture says top secret at the bottom, so don't tell anyone you saw this. Kennedy also delivered a warning to Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, stating that he would consider any attack from Cuba an attack by the Soviet Union, which would trigger U.S. retaliation against the Soviets themselves. Kennedy's decisions led the country and the world close to the beginning of a nuclear war, closer than any other time in history. On day 11, October 26, Khrushchev communicated to the U.S. that the Soviets would remove their missiles if President Kennedy would publicly guarantee that the United States would not invade Cuba in the future. On day 13, October 28, Khrushchev announced on Moscow radio that he had agreed to remove Soviet missiles from Cuba. After 13 days of anxious waiting, days of meetings and threats as Soviet ships approached the U.S. Navy patrol line, the crisis was finally over. Following the crisis, there were signs of lessening tension between the Soviet Union and the United States, as the leaders of both nations understood just how close the world had come to nuclear war. Two actions signaled a warming in relations between the superpowers: the establishment of a teletype hotline between the Kremlin and the White House, and the signing of the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty on July 25, 1963. In a commencement address at American University in 1963, President Kennedy called for a strategy of peace that would make the world a safer place. He told the country, "For, in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal." The Cuban Missile Crisis is a clear example of the use of power, the depth of power, and the impact of power held by the President of the United States, and the executive branch. It's also a good example of why presidents lose all of the pigmentation in their hair.